What is going on, college basketball fans, and welcome to episode 2 of the Danny Hoops podcast. I can't believe we made it this far. We made it to the second episode of the podcast, and we are going to be continuing to do these every single Thursday night at 10 p.m. live. But if you cannot join us live, that is completely understandable because they will be up on YouTube under the live section, and we may even post them as a video after for you guys to listen on throughout the weekend, anytime that is best for you. So we got some good stuff lined up today, but before we get into it, I just want to ask you guys, for you guys listening afterwards and you guys watching live, please drop a like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're going to be doing these every single Thursday night, like I said, with a bunch more college basketball content as well every single day. So if you are a college basketball fan, this is the place for you. So definitely subscribe and follow me on Twitter. I'm always watching the games, giving live updates there on the Twitter, so you don't want to miss it. So some stuff we got lined up to talk about on the podcast today. I want to talk a little bit of mid-major because the A10 has been a little bit stinky, a little bit disappointing. We need to address that. And I also want to talk about some of the best mid-major teams, in my opinion, that I think could potentially get a win in March or pull off an upset in March. In representation of that, I'm rocking my Loyola Chicago Ramblers. For those of you watching here on YouTube, rocking the Loyola shirt, talking some A10, talking some mid-major. After that, we're going to talk about some of my sleeper teams I think could make a deep run in the tournament that really aren't being talked about that much and not really being in the top 25, not being in most people's rankings at this point in the season. And then we are going to preview some of the big games for this weekend, including Houston versus Alabama, Indiana versus Arizona. There are some really good games, and I'm going to be having my predictions out for those as a video tomorrow on Friday, December, I think, 9th. So I am ready to get started. And of course, at the end of the podcast, as always, we are going to be giving you guys my top 3 AP Player of the Year candidates and my top 3 national championship contenders at this point. And after that, we will take your guys' questions at the end of the podcast. That is going to be a weekly routine where I give you guys my top Player of the Year candidates and my top national championship contenders, and then take your questions. That's going to be a weekly thing. But let's get into our first portion of this podcast, which is indeed some mid-major talk. And it is talking about how the A10 Atlantic 10 Conference has been a very disappointing league and are really looking like they might be a one-bid league this season, which is surprising. There's so many good teams preseason that we thought maybe might be pretty good, and we're going to get into all those teams. But for them to only have one team come out, and that probably being their conference champion, like most of these lower league teams that make the tournament, that's very disappointing considering they usually are getting 2, 3, maybe even 4 teams into the tournament each year of the past few years. So some of the A10 teams that have been very disappointing includes Dayton. I think Dayton, we can all agree, has been almost unanimously a top 25 team preseason, but they just haven't showed up. Malachi Smith on Dayton, really the whole team has just been very disappointing and hasn't shown up. They do have Darren Holmes on that team, who I think is playing really good, but it's just not enough. Dayton is sitting at 5-5 at this point in the season with no good wins and some pretty bad losses up to this point. Also, Davidson. Davidson looked to be promising at the start of the season, the first few games. Foster Loyer is a great shooter, and he could really actually make some noise in March. But the problem is Davidson already has 2 losses to not so great teams. They lost to Delaware, which the Blue Hens, they did make the tournament last year. They might make the tournament again if they can win their league, but still, not the best loss to have there on your resume if you are Davidson. They also lost to the Charlotte 49ers, which is definitely an even worse loss than even to Delaware. So two bad losses there for Davidson already to start the league. And then to start there. And then St. Louis. St. Louis was looking really good. Yuri Collins is killing it, especially. He might be one of the best, if not the best passer in the league. I also think of Shavir Wheeler there at Kentucky. He is definitely up there with the best passers in the country. But St. Louis lost to Iona the other night by more than 20 points. And I know it's a Rick Pitino coach team, but this is still the Iona Gales. They still don't have that great of a record so far up to this point in the season. So St. Louis not only losing to them, but losing by over 20. Very disappointing, and the A10 is really not looking good. The two bright spots from the Atlantic 10 Conference up to this point in the season, I will say, is Duquesne. Duquesne has been a big surprise with their transfer star, Day Grant, averaging almost 20 a game. He looks to be really good. And also Fordham. Fordham is 9-1, and their only loss is to Arkansas. Although I will say that Arkansas loss did come by over 20 points, pretty much a 30-point loss there to Arkansas. But Fordham might be their only hope. I could say if Fordham doesn't win their conference tournament, I could see Fordham maybe getting another bid, so then the A10 gets a second bid. But really, the way the rest of these teams are playing and how disappointing they have been, I think the Atlantic 10 is going to be a one bid league this season to make the March Madness tournament this year. But next, a little bit more mid-major talk. We got some teams that I believe could pull off an upset in March Madness up to this point. I will call them, the best mid-major teams in my opinion so far up to this point in the season. First up, we got the College of Charleston there in South Carolina. First time ever they won the tournament that they're always in, which is the Charleston Classic Invitational Tournament. They won that tournament, got a 2-point win over Virginia Tech, who we might be talking about later. A very good team. Their only loss is to North Carolina, and I know North Carolina has had their struggles, but still a very good team and a team that is just way more athletic than this Charleston team. I think Charleston, they get into the tournament, they could make some noise with a win or two, pulling off some upsets. Keep an eye out here for Charleston. Some of the other better mid-major teams, we got San Diego State. San Diego State, they're usually pretty good. They don't usually show up in March, even whenever they've had teams where they were a top 5 seed. They just never really seem to show up in March. And I don't know whether that's to blame coaching or what it really is, or if teams are just really preparing for them more. But defensively, they're just a very good team. They got a solid squad there for San Diego State. And I do think the Aztecs do have potential to pull off an upset and make a run as a mid-major in March Madness. Also, UNLV, undefeated UNLV, looking pretty good up to this point. I think that they could shock some people, maybe get a win there in March Madness. New Mexico, kind of the same story as UNLV. Both those teams really haven't played anyone up to this point, but those are definitely some mid-majors to look out for to pull off some upsets there in the tournament. St. Mary's. Okay, St. Mary's, I thought this year was maybe going to have a little bit of a down year because last year, they were a 5 seed. Everyone was pretty high on them because they beat Gonzaga during last year, and that Gonzaga team wasn't losing very often during the regular season. So for St. Mary's to do that, I thought they'd take a little bit of a dip because, they weren't bringing back a ton of players from last year's team. But St. Mary's is a well-coached team and a team that even whenever they have players graduate, all that stuff, they just come back and they play the same way. And yes, it is nice to have a really good player, but they really didn't have that last year. They were just a good defensive team. They slow the pace down. They use pretty much all the shot clock when they go down. They make you play their game. And if you're going to beat St. Mary's, you're going to have to beat them playing St. Mary's basketball, and that's just the way they are. Also, my last mention for these best mid-major teams that I believe could pull off an upset or two in March, UAB, the University of Alabama, Birmingham. They are really good. They only have one loss up to this point in the season, and they have the leading scorer in Division One. And we've seen some of these mid-major teams that had the leading scorer in Division One basketball, make the tournament. Everybody's like, oh my gosh, they have the best player in the country, statistical wise, not be able to perform whenever it comes to March. But I think this UAB team could be different. Kind of what comes to mind with Jordan Jelly Walker, different play styles, but Ja Morant, when he was with Murray State and they got a 12 seed, was one of the leading scorers in Division One basketball, and they were able to pull off an upset win, 12-5, there over Marquette. And I could definitely see Jordan Walker, completely different play styles, really, from Ja Morant to Jordan Jelly Walker. But I think just the impact, I could see something similar if UAB gets another 12 seed this year, like last year. Look out for the Blazers when we get to March. So, next section of the podcast, I want to talk about some of my sleeper teams that I think could, be sleepers to make a little bit of a run in March, maybe make the Sweet 16, maybe get a little bit of further. Also, I see you guys in the chat. I don't really consider Gonzaga a mid-major with how well they are recruiting nowadays. So I kind of left them out. But technically, yeah, they're a mid-major conference. But I kind of left them out of this portion just because, I personally don't really consider them a mid-major program. But to my sleeper teams, my first one, I have Marquette. And they have shown their peak when they are playing at their best. They could really go toe to toe with some of the top teams in the country. They defeated Baylor by 30 points, was forcing a ton of turnovers. I mean, that team that I saw against Baylor by this Marquette team looked like a VCU Shaka Smart coach team where they're forcing turnovers, they're running in transition, they're finishing at the rack, getting a ton of transition points, and it was so much fun to watch. And we seen Shaka Smart with a team like that in VCU make the Final Four. So I could definitely see Marquette as a sleeper team to make a little bit of a run in this tournament. So these, just some teams I'm keeping an eye out for at this point in the season. They got Cam Jones, only a sophomore, averaging over 15 a game. Look out for him there. Also, Oliver Maxence Prosper, good forward there, also can provide you some scoring. So it's good, even when you have those teams that force a lot of turnovers, score in transition, to have some guys that you can say, okay, go out there and get me a bucket. And I think this Marquette team has that. They just got to figure it out here before March. Big East play starts here, I think, next week. So a lot of good tests that they will have in that league. But right now, I would probably put Marquette as the third or fourth best team in the Big East Conference, just behind UConn. I'd still put Creighton above them. And then, them and Xavier, could really switch. But it really depends on which one between Marquette and Xavier kind of becomes more consistent for me as to who is really going to go up there and grab that third place in the Big East Conference, and maybe even potentially pass up Creighton with the way they have been playing lately. But I still think Creighton's going to bounce back after that loss to Nebraska. Very much looking forward to watching Creighton play there in Big East play. My next sleeper team, I got two more. I got Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech has looked pretty good, and they got two guys on their team who are very good scorers, and that includes Sean Padula and Grant Bazile. They also got a beast on the glass there in Justin Mutz, and this team looks pretty good. We saw last year they weren't really supposed to make the March Madness tournament last season, but they made a run in the ACC tournament, defeated Duke, knocked off some of these top guys in their conference, and was able to win themselves an automatic bid going into March. And, they've shown that they can make runs with this coaching staff and with this team. I think this Virginia Tech team has shown me a lot at this point in the season. Their only loss is the College of Charleston, but they got some good wins. They got a good win over North Carolina. They They've been playing just really good basketball lately. I got my eye out on the Hokies at this point in the season. And my last sleeper team right now, maybe a little bit biased, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. Let's go with the West Virginia Mountaineers. And West Virginia is kind of like, and I'm saying this as a West Virginia fan, they're kind of like, the off-brand version of UConn. And I say that not trying to be mean, but they have really good depth. They play 10 to 12 guys pretty much every night. Usually, 10, 11, 12 might be a stretch, but they do sometimes. Really well coached Bob Huggins team. They play great defense. They got some good scoring guards. They're just not quite, the players just aren't quite as talented, in my opinion, as UConn's, and especially at the center position with Sanogo. That is such a big upgrade over guys like Jimmy Bell there for West Virginia. But I do think that West Virginia still has potential to maybe make a Sweet 16 push this season and knock off some teams because their play style is very good and they have really good depth. And if they are forcing a lot of turnovers, forcing you to run, they could really just tire you out with this deep bench and all these great defensive guards. We have at least 4 defensive guards that are just really going to pick you apart throughout the games. So I like WVU to maybe be a potential sleeper to make a run in March. So, next portion of the podcast, and I'm very excited to preview some of these games that are happening this weekend because Saturday and Sunday this weekend, we get ourselves some treats because there are some really good top 10 matchups, and that includes this Saturday in Houston. We have the number 1 team in the country getting their first real test against Alabama. We're just going to kind of talk about them a little bit. I'm probably going to have my predictions out for these games tomorrow and a few more games than we're going to talk about. I will have those out. So, our first game, Houston versus Alabama. Is Houston, I know it is a home game, going to be able to survive a Alabama team that has a star freshman in Brandon Miller and a good point guard there in Mark Sears, transfer from Ohio? And I think that Houston, this is going to test Houston out a lot with their really good backcourt in Marcus Sasser and Jamal Sheed. Um, this is going to be a big test for them defensively. Are they going to be able to finish out this game? Because, like I said, Houston has yet to be tested. Their best win is probably against St. Mary's at home. And even in that game, St. Mary's was forcing Houston to play St. Mary's basketball, and they were really close to coming away with a W in that game. And then also on the road at Oregon, that, Oregon has shown to be not as good as we anticipated, and that win doesn't quite look as good. So even with this one, it's not a true road game here for Houston, but it is going to be their first true test up against a top 10 team. Very much looking forward to seeing how Houston is able to perform in this one and if they can continue to stay undefeated. Our next matchup that we are going to preview in this one, we got Arizona versus Indiana. And I think I'm more excited for this game than I am Alabama versus Houston. Arizona and Indiana have very kind of different play styles, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it kind of meshes because Indiana, they got Xavier Johnson, a good defensive guard, a guy who can get some buckets. And it is on a neutral site court, I will say, in Las Vegas. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Jalen Smith-Shifino has been an underrated freshman up to this point in the season. In my opinion, I think that he could have a big impact by the time we get down to the end of the season. Also, Trace Jackson Davis has been one of the best players in the country. So I look forward to seeing how he's going to do against these good big men there in Arizona because they do have a center who is a big guy, and TJD is not just going to be able to body him up, drop step, and get a bucket. So it's going to be a little bit difficult. Arizona puts up a lot of points. So I could see this game going a lot of ways. Very much looking forward to watching Arizona versus Indiana, two top teams in the country right now. Also, another team kind of getting their first true test this weekend, and not quite to the level of facing an Alabama team, but Auburn, an undefeated team who is really yet to play anyone too great at this point in the season, is getting to go up against a Penny Hardaway led team uh, with a great point guard transfer from SMU, Kendrick Davis, who is maybe one of the best scorers in the country. So, although it isn't an extreme test for Auburn, it is a good test, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this Auburn team plays because I'm going to learn a lot about them when they're going up against this Memphis squad. So very much looking forward to that one. Is Auburn for real? Can they stay undefeated against this good Memphis team? Also, a good mid-major matchup. Two, from what we talked about earlier, teams that I believe could possibly get an upset when we get to March Madness, and that is between San Diego State and St. Mary's. Two very good defensive teams, which is why I'm excited to watch this one. This one's being played in a neutral site court as well. Two Cali teams heading over to Arizona to play in this one. It's going to be a defensive battle. It might be first one to 45-50 might win this one. Super excited for it. Again, we're going to do my predictions for all these in a video tomorrow morning. That should be out. Also, big game in Columbia, Missouri, because we got a big time rivalry between Kansas and Missouri, and Missouri undefeated, hasn't really played anyone up to this point. Kansas's only loss is to Tennessee in a bad loss, but it is at home for Missouri. Are they going to be able to pull off a big time upset, stay undefeated against their rival? Very excited for that game. Another game, top matchup between Maryland and Tennessee. This one is on Sunday, the 11th. Super excited for that one as well. And let's not forget the best matchup of the weekend. We have a team that is yet to get a win versus a team with one win, both coming from the ACC conference, and that is the big time powerhouse matchup between Louisville and Florida State. Who is going to win? Can Louisville pick up their first win? Can Florida State pick up their second win? It is going to be a battle for sure. So now let's move in to the end point of this podcast. I want to talk to you guys about my top AP Player of the Year candidates up to this point in the season, and also my top national championship contenders. And then after we get through that, I will take your guys' questions for the podcast. So, my top AP National Player of the Year candidates up to this point in the season, I still have at number one Zach Edey. And how could you not at least have him in your top five or so? I mean, Zach Edey is putting up unreal numbers. I say this all the time. He's the Yao Ming of college basketball. He's an unstoppable force. He's averaging a double-double, over 20 points a game. Dude is a force, and he is a mismatch problem for about 99% of the country. If you do have a guy who can somehow body him up and match up well against them, you could still say that, well, yeah, he's got the height to guard Zach Edey. He's got the size to guard Zach Edey, but Edey still might have the skill advantage and still be able to score on him as well. So right now, I got Zach Edey as my National Player of the Year. At number two, we have a new number two this week. This week, I have from Illinois actually. Terrence Shannon Jr., in my opinion, has been the best forward in basketball this season. He's been lighting it up from 3 point. They just got a big time win over Texas. And I know he hasn't, he didn't play the greatest game against Texas, but when it mattered, when it was in overtime, he was a closer and he got his buckets. Terrence Shannon Jr. down the stretch of that Texas game sealed the win for Illinois. And even when he wasn't impacting the game scoring wise, throughout regulation, he showed up to close it out for his team. And really throughout the season, he's been averaging 20 a game. He's been on fire from behind the arc. He's a great athlete, and he's going to get some highlight dunks. I mean, what is there not to love about Terrence Shannon Jr.? Not to mention he is a two-way player. He is an excellent, excellent defender, originally coached there at Texas Tech by Chris Beard. So he is a great defender. Now they're with Brad Underwood. Two really good coaches to learn under, and Terrence Shannon Jr. Is coming in here at number 2 for me. And at number 3, I had kind of trouble finding my third AP Player of the Year candidate, but I decided to roll with Jalen Wilson here out of Kansas. The numbers don't lie. He's averaging over 20. Kansas is winning games. And although they haven't really won a big game, you could say, yeah, they won the game against Duke earlier in the year. Still, I would have them behind these first two guys. But definitely as they get into Big 12 play, if he's able to maintain his production, maintain averaging 20 points a game throughout Big 12 play, I think you have to consider Jalen Wilson a top National Player of the Year candidate. So let's move on now to my national championship contenders up to this point, because I got 3 of them. And I got a new team in here because last week, I think I had Virginia number 1, Texas number 2, Houston number 3, but now we have a brand new top 3 mixed around a little bit. So my new top contender to win it all at this point in the season, and I know they're untested, big test this Saturday against Alabama. I have the Houston Cougars. This could come back to bite me in the butt saying this right before they get their first big test of the season. But right now, I think Houston has a really good core, a good bench. They play hard for Coach Sampson. Well-coached team, great defensive team as always. Houston always is. They got a great, great backcourt, and you always, even when the past few years, including this year, college basketball has been riddled with great big men and great centers in college basketball. Still, you have to rely on, in March, a really good backcourt, veteran backcourt with experience to lead your team through the games in March Madness. And Houston, in my opinion, probably has the best backcourt in the nation between Marcus Sasser and Jamal Sheed. I also think that Jarris Walker, the freshman center, is only going to improve more and more throughout the year. I'm very high on him and his potential. I think he's being a little bit slept on, or maybe just not getting recognition because he is a freshman. People might not know about him yet, but he will arrive, I think, before March and be a great center. He's a good defensive center, hustle guy, and he's going to be able to get you some buckets down low as well. I also believe another freshman there in Houston coming off the bench, great shooter, and I like this Houston team as a core, top to bottom, really great team, one of, if not the best backcourt in the nation. That's going to help you a lot, bring you a long way, along with their top defense. So, my second national championship contender team, we also have a new number 2. Since Texas lost last week, kind of their first real test away from home in the Moody Center against Illinois, Texas was unable to get it done. And that showed me a lot because I already kind of had some question marks, some alarm bells ringing up here about this Longhorns team. And they did show me a lot of potential. But I'm not high on them enough as to put them in my top three at this point. But my number two, my brand new number two coming in, I just made a video about them the other day and posted it this morning, and that is the UConn Huskies. UConn is the deepest team in the country. I mean, top to bottom, their 10 guys could go up against any 10 guys in the nation, and you'd be worried if you had to play your top 10 guys against theirs. Look out. They also have a really good backcourt, and maybe not as experienced as Houston in the backcourt, which is maybe why I have them here at number two. But still, Tristan Newton and Jordan Hawkins are a great duo to have back there. And not to mention, they have a point forward there with Andre Jackson Jr., who has been lighting it up on every facet of the game, whether it's getting the passes, because he's a true point forward, getting the assists, getting the rebounds. He doesn't really have a jump shot, but that is starting to come along. If he gets a jump shot anytime throughout the season, look out. But even without it, defensively, every other facet of the game, he is impacting the game in a positive way. And I really like this UConn team. And I've said all that about how great this team is, and I haven't even mentioned Adama Sanogo, who is a beast down low. Every time I watch this UConn team, I get higher and higher on them. And when I watched them against Florida last night, they got some really good freshmen coming off the bench as well, especially Donovan Clingan, who has been killing it. He had a big game against Florida. He is a 7'2" freshman center. They toss up lobs to him. He's pretty much unstoppable, and look out for him to progress throughout the season as well. When you have a 7'2" guy who can go out there and do that, coming off the bench for a Sanogo, I mean, you got a really good depth at your center position for sure. And my third and final national championship contender for this week of the Danny Hoops podcast. Again, we are going to give you guys an update at the end of the podcast on my top AP Player of the Year candidates and my top national championship candidates every single week here on the Danny Hoops podcast. And after, I will, of course, take your guys' questions. So if you guys want to go ahead and put your questions in the chat while I talk a little bit about Virginia, because Virginia is my third and final national championship contender up to this point. We talked about experience with the other two teams. Well, Virginia's got a lot of experience. They got a really good coach who has done it before. The first coach on this list, which of course has already won a national championship, and that is Tony Bennett. He has a point guard on his team who was part of that 2019 championship run, and Kihei Clark. They got Reese Beekman, who is maybe one of the maybe the best defensive wings in the country, and he's starting to develop getting his own bucket as well, so that's huge. Not to mention they got really good forwards with Jaden Gardner and them boys. Look out for Virginia. Very, very experienced team, and I would definitely be afraid to play them in March. Still undefeated up to this point. My top three teams are still undefeated. That being, again, Houston, UConn, and Virginia. In that order are my top three teams who I think could win the national championship this year. So now we will get into the final part of this podcast. And if you guys are in the live portion of this on YouTube, you guys can drop your questions there in the chat. This podcast will also be on Spotify, so if you guys are listening there on the audio version, definitely consider to come down on YouTube at Dannyology and subscribe, because we will be doing these live every Thursday night at 10. If you guys want your question answered, come join the live and put it in the chat. If not, it will be up as a video later on YouTube, and also continuing to put the audio versions on Spotify. So let's go ahead and get to our first question coming in here from Drake. My man Drake Berry says, how big of a boost do you think the Michigan win gave Kentucky? For me, I think it gave them a big boost up to this point in the season because before that, Kentucky hasn't really had a good win. And whenever they played teams like Gonzaga and even Michigan State there in the Champions Classic, it wasn't even that close of a game. So I think a lot of people were kind of worrying about Kentucky, but then getting that win over Michigan, a Michigan team that I know this game was at home, but played Virginia very close, a Virginia team that is, nationally recognized as one of the top teams in the country. I think that Michigan win it said, okay, Kentucky, they're still there. We can't just overlook them. They'll be back, and in my opinion, I still think Kentucky is going to have a really good season and make a little bit of a run in the tournament, maybe to the Sweet 16. I don't know if they can get past that at this point from what I'm seeing, but with Oscar Tshiebwe and with the surrounding cast around them, Wheeler, Carson Wallace is a stud. He's going to be a superstar. If he continues to progress throughout the season, look out. And also Jacob Toppin as well. Those are the two X factors for me. Carson Wallace, who has already shown a ton of signs of being a superstar, and also Jacob Toppin. If those two X factors could really start to be super consistent for this team as scorers, and we see the Oscar that we saw last year, look out for Kentucky to make a little bit of a run. So, next question here coming in here from Huge Duke Fan for Life. Welcome back to the stream. Appreciate you guys. What dark horse team do you think could win the conference tournaments in the ACC, SEC, Big Ten, Big East, Big 12, and the Pac-12? So for the Power Six conferences, who would I say are sleepers to win their conference tournaments and steal a bid to the big dance? So we'll start in the order that you have. So ACC, I think if we're talking like true sleepers, how about Louisville? No, I'm joking, but you always got to watch out here for Syracuse. And I know Syracuse hasn't looked the best this year, and they really do have some bad losses up to this point in the season. But you still got to watch out for them. They got a Hall of Fame coach there, a coach who has got made sleeper runs in March Madness before. So you got to look out for Syracuse there. Also, top of my mind, I'm thinking Notre Dame. Notre Dame is a team. They beat Michigan State, and I know so did Northwestern. So how big of a win is that win for Notre Dame? But still, you got to consider it. I think Notre Dame has a really good freshman there in, I think his last name is Sterling. I've watched a few Notre Dame games this year. I would say Syracuse just because of Jim Boeheim, but my real pick for the ACC would have to be Notre Dame at this point in the season because I don't think that they will get a bid based on what they do in the season, but they could slip around and maybe win the conference tournament and steal a bid to the big dance. The SEC. The SEC, a little bit tricky. I would have said probably at the beginning of the year Florida, but Florida does not look as good, Colin Castleton has shown he's getting shut down not only by UConn, but my West Virginia Mountaineers. West Virginia beat them by 30, and that really turned me off of there on Florida. I think for the SEC, I'm gonna go with a team that almost did it last year in Texas A&M. Good coach there in Buzz Williams. Look out for the Aggies there in the SEC. You could also say maybe Missouri. Missouri is a team that is undefeated at this point in the season, so they could get a bid without winning the conference if they are continuing to win games. They got a big game against Kansas this weekend, so I would say Missouri if they don't get an automatic bid, and then probably Texas A&M as well for the SEC. The Big Ten. The Big Ten, I got one on my mind already, and that is Rutgers. Rutgers already got a big win against Indiana. They're a team that I believe is probably going to be close to the bubble all season long. I could definitely see Rutgers being in there as a team to get a bid. They got a good center in a Morier. I'm really a big fan of, and then they got a really good wing defender in Caleb McConnell, who has, over the past 2 seasons really been an amazing on-ball defender, off-ball defender, just all-around defender there at the wing position. So definitely look out for Rutgers in the Big Ten. For the Big East, so other than the top 4 teams there in the Big East, you have UConn, you have Creighton, you have Marquette and Xavier, in my opinion, are the top 4 in the Big East. I would say look out for St. John's if they don't get an automatic bid. I could see the Red Storm there maybe being a bubble team. I could see them trying to get a steal a bid there in the tournament. Other than St. John's, maybe actually, and I know we don't really want to hear this, but don't sleep on Villanova because they are a really good team and have some good players who have a ton of experience. So I would actually probably go Villanova because I do think St. John's is closer to getting a bid without winning the conference tournament. So give me Villanova. I know they had some bad losses up to this point in the season, but I think they could work their way back up, especially with star freshman Cam Whitmore, who only played the past few games, and he has been killing it in for Villanova since he got back. And 2 more, we got the Big 12. The Big 12 is interesting because a lot of teams in the Big 12 are probably going to make it into the tournament no matter what. I mean, I'd say the Big 12 gets at least 7 or 8 bids this season. So I would probably go Texas Tech, though. Texas Tech is a team that hasn't looked as good as they normally do over the past few years. So I could actually see Texas Tech being towards the bottom of the Big 12 this year. So I could see them kind of sneakily winning their conference tournament. And then finally the Pac-12. The Pac-12 is difficult because there's not that many good teams in the Pac-12, but I'll go Arizona State. Arizona State is a team that got a good win over Michigan already this year and has shown to be pretty good. Look out for the Sun Devils here this season. Next question coming in here from my boy Alex. Actually, not a question. My bad. Yo, what's up, HW Vibes? Shout out to you. We got one coming in here from Nonstop Sports Kids, and he says, do I think that Duke is as good as last year? And as good as last year, I would say no. Short answer, no. Long answer, reasoning, because you lost Paulo Banchero. You lost a lot of great players from last year's team. I mean, it's hard to tell at this point. You still got Jeremy Roach, who is a really good veteran point guard and has been leading this team to some good wins. And they did just get a big win over Iowa, held Chris Murray to only like 6 points the other night. That was a really good win for Duke. But they're going to need some freshmen. These freshmen that they depend on coming in every year, it's very possible that they could just have a down year. And their freshmen might take a little bit more time to develop because they bring in these top guys who are going to be NBA prospects like Derek Lively Jr., like Derek Whitehead, who just haven't quite shown up this year. There are 2 freshmen that have shown up this year, really 3 freshmen. They have 5 freshmen that are, other than Jeremy Roach, are probably their next 5 guys. And that includes Kyle Flipowski, who has been killing it, one of the best freshmen in the country, Tyrese Proctor, who has been killing it, Mark Mitchell, who I think has been pretty good, and then the 2 that were supposed to be the top 2 out of these 5 who have been the bottom 2, and I know they've had their injuries, but I would say Duke is not as good as last year. But if Derek Lively and Derek Whitehead can pick up the production and be the stars that that we all kind of thought that they would be at the start of the year, I could definitely see Duke trying to make a run, but to be that Final Four team of last year led by Paulo Banchero and those boys, I just don't see it. I don't think Duke is as good as last year. I don't see them sniffing the Final Four this year, but still a pretty good team that they have there. We got one coming in here from Jalen. He says, what current ranked team would you worry about struggling in conference play? I worry a little bit about Texas, and the loss against Illinois worries me a little bit because the Big 12 is a gauntlet. You're going to have to play in the Big 12 every other team in your league on the road. And they have shown they can get some big wins at home. They haven't really proven that they can get some big wins on the road, and with some really good environments like Allen Fieldhouse, WVU Coliseum, even. I mean, Iowa State, Texas Tech, all of these teams have crazy good environments. I worry about Texas Tech, maybe taking a little bit of a hit when we get into conference play. And yeah, uh, yeah, I would probably go Texas at this point. I also trying to think of another team that I would maybe think about struggling when they get into conference play. I was trying to think like of the top teams because you said ranked. Yeah, off the top of my head, I would probably go Texas. The Big 12 is a gauntlet, man. It's a gauntlet. We got another one coming in here from huge Duke fan for life. He says, "What do you think of the talk of possibly expanding the NCAA tournament and possibly having a only Power 5 conference tournament?" I don't like that. I don't really like that at all. Um, I think the NCAA tournament is perfect. At 64 teams, the field is perfect. Every single conference gets an automatic bid. It leads to so many upsets, so much drama, so many buzzer beaters, close games, Cinderella runs. It is perfect just the way it is. I hope that they don't change it at all. I know with college football, there's a lot of talk. There's expansion going on and a lot of stuff, but that's because college football is so flawed. But college basketball and March Madness is so perfect. I don't think they need to expand it at all. I love 64 teams. I think it's perfect. No need to go down. No need to go up. I think it's good. I would keep it the same. So we got a few more questions that I will take before we end the podcast. Make sure if you guys are listening live, if you guys are listening to this on YouTube as a video afterwards, or if you guys are listening on Spotify, head over to YouTube, hit that subscribe button. Really helps me out. We're getting close to 2,000 subs. And not only do we have a podcast for college basketball every single Thursday, but we have a ton more college basketball content every single day. You don't want to miss it. Make sure you guys hit that subscribe button. So we got about 3 more questions coming in here, and then we will end episode 2 of the Danny Hoops podcast. So we got another one coming in here from Nonstop Sports Kids. He says, do you think Kentucky can make a run to the Final Four this upcoming year? This year coming from a Kentucky fan. Final Four run is tough, and we kind of talked about Kentucky earlier, but I like what I saw against Michigan. I think I need to see a little bit more. If we see the Oscar Tshiebwe from last year, which we saw in a few games since he's been back, and also the X factors for me are for sure Carson Wallace. Can he emerge as maybe the best freshman in the country? I think it's possible. There are some really good freshmen this year, but Carson Wallace has shown that potential, and also Jacob Toppin. If Jacob Toppin can be a scorer, a great defender, rebounder, all that they need there from that position, I could definitely see Kentucky, improving. But at this point, I could see a Sweet 16 run by Kentucky, but I don't see them getting into the Final Four. We got another one coming in here from Drake Berry. He says, "Do you think the Mountain West is going to be good this year and be a strong presence in March, or do you think they'll fall on their face in the tournament again?" Yeah, I was one last year that was a big believer in the Mountain West Conference with these teams in Boise State, Wyoming. They all lost first round. They didn't get a single win in March last year. And honestly, I think I believe that they're going to fall on their face again. I see a couple teams that are probably going to get bids this year. Definitely San Diego State. And San Diego State usually falls on their face when they get to March. And I like to see mid majors make pushes in March. And most people do, as long as it's not against their favorite team, right? But San Diego State has just consistently, not been able to get it done in March. So I have to say, at this point, the Mountain West, I don't believe in, and not only San Diego State, but I know Utah State and UNLV are undefeated at this point. Haven't really played anyone, but I could see both of those teams possibly getting a bid, and I don't see them getting wins in March. I just don't. Also, Wyoming, still a solid team. They made the tournament last year. They've had some injuries with their best player, Graham Ike. If they can get him back, I could see Wyoming or San Diego State are the Mountain West's best chances to get a win in March. But even then, I don't think I trust them right now. So we got our last question of the podcast from Huge Duke Fan for Life. He says, "What mid-major team do you think could make the Final Four?" And that one's tough because I'm not sure if I could see any mid-major team make the Final Four up to this point in the season. If I had to pick one, I think I would probably go. It would be a team out of nowhere, like somewhere like we saw St. Peter's make the Elite Eight. The year before, we saw Oral Roberts make the Sweet 16. We seen a team like Loyola Chicago make the Final Four before, and it's just out of nowhere, man. It's out of nowhere, and I think it would have to be a team out of nowhere. These teams that I believe are top teams in the country, I think could get a win or two in March. I don't see any of them making the Final Four. If I had to pick one, I would go with St. Mary's because of how they've shown. They played a very, very close game against Houston on the road, and we're forcing them to play St. Mary's basketball. I could see them if they're playing like that, they get lucky on the Cinderella run, hit a few buzzer beaters, a lot like this Loyola Chicago team did, was able to really Cinderella their way all the way to the Final Four. They would need some help from other teams to kind of knock off the top teams in their region. But I would say St. Mary's would probably be my pick if I had to choose. But if a mid-major team makes the Final Four this year, I think it would be out of nowhere. It would be a team that nobody's expecting, and it would also be a lot of fun. So that is going to do it for episode 2 of the Danny Hoops podcast. I really appreciate all you guys coming in here live and asking me the questions. I'm super excited to continue doing the podcast every single Thursday. And again, make sure you guys subscribe. If you guys have not already, hit that like button so I know you guys want to continue seeing these podcasts. And yeah, guys, thank you so much for watching. I'm out.